All right, looks like we're live. So first things first, I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. I really appreciate everyone coming out virtually and showing your support. Hopefully this is going to be a slightly interesting discussion. If you do have, I just want to let everyone know, if you do have any questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A. Would love to keep this as interactive as possible, but we will have Ala, who is one of our team members, looking over the questions and kind of picking out the best ones as well. So please feel free to comment and add questions as you see fit. I'm really looking forward to engage. So the topic today is, dear detection engineers, you deserve better. The kind of subtext here is stumbling blocks in detection engineering. So the original title was, I guess, a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Marketing decided that stumbling blocks in detection engineering was a better title, and I somewhat agree. So today what we'll do is we're going to talk about a few things. First, we're going to do background on SOC Prime and myself, and then we're going to cover kind of what makes detection engineering hard and why it's hard and what that means and what kind of the impact that has on the community and as each of us as individuals. The second half of this is going to be kind of describing why you deserve better and how you can deserve better and how we should think about detection engineering and kind of try to move, again, not just the community, but ourselves as individuals forward so that we can do better and be kind of more satisfied with ourselves and the work that we do at the end of the day. So let's get right into it. We'll just start very briefly with the company background, SOC Prime. So SOC Prime's been around since 2015. I think we're at like 70 plus people now. We have customers in lots of different industries, and kind of one of our main things is that we're cross-platform compatible or cross-platform support. So if you didn't guess by the name, we specialize in security analytics and SOC, and working with all of the different SIEM platforms and EDR platforms is something that's really important to us. As a whole, our approach or our thought is that we see ourselves as a platform for advancing security analytics through the combination of two things, which is the technology and industry expertise. Our kind of DNA is that the organization itself is kind of founded on analysts, engineers, and developers, and we see ourselves as building this coalition of industry experts and trying to drive what we see as needed change in security analytics. This whole discussion, this whole webinar is kind of in that same vein, right? Security analytics has a lot to do in order to grow, and that all that change and all that growth is possible. We just need to all get on board and start having real conversations about security analytics, having real conversations about how do we move things forward and elevating that level of dialogue. So hopefully that's something that we can achieve with today's webinar. A little bit of background on myself. That's a picture of me on the right-hand side. I have been in security analytics for roughly 4-ish years now. My previous employment was with an MDR/MSSP. I started off as a SOC analyst, and anybody who, this is obviously just a personal opinion, but anybody who becomes a SOC analyst wants to stop being a SOC analyst as soon as possible. And I think that's a shame, honestly, because it is such a very critical role. Not just anyone can do it. It does require some level of expertise, some level of critical thinking, and it doesn't have to be the case that SOC analysts don't enjoy their jobs, because if we as detection engineers did a better job, they might not hate theirs so much. So I really think it's a shame that people are so eager to leave their SOC analyst roles, and that's not on them, right? It's the system, it's the situation that we've put them in, and the kind of situation that we've created. And so that's obviously one of the things that I want to change. Is I don't want to see people necessarily like me who are so eager to leave their SOC analyst roles. But I was able to leave that role very quickly because in my tenure as a SOC analyst, what I saw were so many opportunities to automate, so many opportunities to enrich, and so many opportunities to just make being a SOC analyst not suck so much. And so that's how I was able to move up to sim engineering and content development. And I spent roughly 2 years doing that. Obviously started off in a kind of more junior role, but by the end of my tenure at that MSSP, I was the kind of sole tier 3 content development engineer. And what that really meant was that I had to kind of maintain all of the sim instances that we had. We had multiple, and not just that, but focus on developing new content and more importantly, new content initiatives, and really focus on figuring out how do we tailor our content and our alerts and essentially the service to maximize the value to our clients and to our customers, right? So that was a lot of customer meetings, a lot of phone calls, a lot of brainstorming sessions, a lot of PowerPoints. It was a fun role, but eventually I figured out that what I'm kind of good at is not just the technical stuff, but also some of the people and business and sales things as well, which is why I moved to SOC Prime. And so at SOC Prime, I have kind of two dual roles. My primary role is as a sales engineer or pre-sales manager. My secondary role is as a technical account manager. Now, I've been with SOC Prime for, again, roughly 2 years now. I was here when it was small, and now we're starting to get really large very fast. I was the only U.S. employee, and now we have quite a large U.S. team. It's really something to see. It's really awesome to be part of something that like this, that has grown so quickly and has evolved so quickly. But back to kind of this role, basically what it means is that I am able to set the expectations for our clients as the sales engineer. And then I have the pleasure of making sure that we actually follow through on those expectations and meet those expectations as a technical account manager. So it's definitely a fun job. Again, it enables me to kind of see things from different perspectives. Sales is not something that I initially thought that I would like, but I actually ended up liking it a lot more than I thought. Yeah, location, I'm in San Diego, California. That picture on the right is actually me in downtown San Diego, right by the water. It's off to the left, you can't really see. And my hobbies are one wheel, which is that kind of skateboard thing that you see me on top of in the picture. It's only got one wheel, as you might imagine. And my other hobby is writing scathing restaurant reviews on Google. So I really love food. Food is something that I think is really important for bringing people together. And kind of building relationships. It's been difficult, obviously, because of COVID. We won't get into that. That's that's a dead horse that I think we can stop beating. But my whole thing is, if you're going to pay someone to make food for you, and they make that food and it's really not up to the quality or the standards that you were expecting, other people should know about it. Right. I don't want other people to have a bad food experience because food is so important to me. So I often end up writing kind of very critical reviews on Google about certain restaurants, depending on what I liked or didn't like. But anyway, yeah, that's me. Let's move on to the next section. So anyone who's actually worked in a SOC, as a SOC analyst, a SIM engineer, as a content developer, they know that detection engineering is hard. But what we've struggled to do as a community is really explain to everyone else why it's so challenging. And again, I think this is kind of a shame, because it's detection engineering ends up not really being acknowledged by the wider security community as kind of a high skill role. I think, at least in the circles that I've run in, blue team and detection engineering is kind of seen as a stepping stone onto greener, bigger, better pastures, aka kind of red team things. I think that's just an aspect of the community that I think is really not quite right. We have this very, very high focus, and we tend to kind of glamorize folks that are really, really, really good at one very particular thing, extreme specialists. Not that those folks aren't amazing, they are, but there is, in my opinion, really a ton of value in not being a specialist and being more of a generalist. And I think detection engineering, it ends up making you more of a generalist. And obviously I'm a little bit biased, right? I'm someone who came from a very technical role and is now in a far less technical role and is involved in sales and customer success. But that's just my opinion, right? I think that we're undervalued in the community, and that's because of our tendency to kind of glamorize, those really highly specialist roles. But part of addressing that is, in my opinion, getting better at describing what we do, right? The kind of easiest way, but really the worst way to describe what we do is to say that we catch bad guys, right? So that's really not enough, right? First off, you got to find who are bad guys. It's 2021, so why can't we be catching bad girls or bad X? How are you catching them? And it's just not a good enough explanation of what we do. The second thing is we generate alerts. So anyone who has touched the SOC probably knows that alerts and incidents are kind of the focus or the fulcrum upon which security operations tends to revolve around or rotate around. And so this is also not a good explanation. We like the stock. Oh, that's a different slide deck. We collect and monitor data to produce interesting security insights. This, I think, is probably the best, highest level description of what we do. But of course, it's also still oversimplified. So yes, we do collect and monitor data, but this does really not come close to scratching the surface of just how complex all of that is. It's so highly nuanced, and it requires so many different layers and levels of expertise in things that it's just it does a disservice to our kind of profession or our specialty if you just stop at that. So what I want to do in the next 2 slides is try and dive more into what exactly are we talking about in terms of domains and processes and responsibilities when it comes to detection engineering. And in order to do that, we have to start with the fundamentals. So the first thing is data, right? We take data from an organization that's generated from the infrastructure, the applications, the security appliances, so like network infrastructure, IDS, IPS, and then we apply some level of analytics to that data to produce some kind of security insight. I say some level of analytics because we should be maybe potentially a little bit clear that we're really not building mathematical models at this point. We're not applying advanced statistics in general. We're really not kind of leveraging AI or ML. And those are for good reasons, but that's a different conversation, right? So we're doing some kind of analysis on data. And then with that data, we are producing security insights, and hopefully those security insights are in an automated fashion. Ideally, those insights also have some kind of automated action or some kind of automated response. And this is again at a high level, what we do in each of the different components. If we had to break detection engineering into 3 components, it would be collecting data, performing some kind of analysis, and then taking some kind of action. Now, those 3 phases can actually be kind of broken up into 2 parts. And these 2 parts I'm calling the engineer parts and the other parts. Now, the engineer parts start by generating data. So you can't analyze data, you can't build reports, alerts, what have you, unless you actually have some data to work with. But more importantly, you can't store data, you can't transmit data unless you're getting data out of something to begin with, right? So you have to figure out where you're going to get data from. Is it going to be an endpoint? Is it going to be the network infrastructure and the appliances? Is it going to be your applications? And just figuring out that part is not as simple as it seems, right? Each of these things, the email gateway, web gateway, next generation firewall, domain controller, proxy, workstations, VM servers, they all have to be configured to output data, right? Most of these don't just generate the logs that you need or that you want by default. They also tend to not generate the logs or the data that you need in the format with the right data points that you need, again, by default. So in addition to figuring out what data do we need, where do we need to pull from, you also need to define how do we need to pull from it. How do we configure each of these log sources to give us the most verbose data as possible, or at least the data that we need? And then how do we configure that to actually output or send or make that data available so that we can then ship that data, right? So you have all your log sources now. Now you need to take that data and actually send it. Send it to where, we'll get to that part. But there's this whole process of kind of building and maintaining the components which are the actual pipeline, right? So maybe you have a syslog server that most of your log sources are sending syslog messages to. Maybe you have a log stash, which is kind of helping you ship data, or Kafka, which is helping you queue and load balance data. Or maybe you have an agent like a connector or a beat. All those things, again, they have to be maintained, and they also have to be configured, right? So you have to, now as part of your kind of regular work as a detection engineer, you have to make sure that you're keeping track of all these different components of your pipeline, making sure that they're not going down, making sure that they're not suffering from performance, that you're receiving events in real time or close to real time, or as close to real time as possible. And of course, you have to set them all up and configure them to begin with, right? It's not really always as simple as just double clicking, setting up a new agent. Sometimes you got to create a new box, you got to create a new VM, you got to figure out firewall permissions and so on. There's just a lot to do in figuring out how to generate and ship your data. The next step here is parsing and storing the data. These are not necessarily two parts that have a specific order. It depends on what solutions you're working with and what your approach is. There are some solutions where you can store the data without parsing it in an unstructured manner. I don't recommend this. We'll talk about this whole process later, but parsing data is ultimately at some point, structuring your data, normalize your data is ultimately at some point a necessity. You cannot store your data without parsing it. Whether you parse it before or you parse it after, that's a little bit more technical, but you still have to parse it at some point. So we'll start with parsing, right? So the first thing is choosing a schema. So you could choose something like the common event format, Leaf, ECS, or CIM, or maybe you just come up with your own schema. It's not necessarily a bad option. There are certain situations where that might be ideal, but you have to figure out how to parse it, right? This means that you now need to probably figure out, number one, how do you configure all those appliances that we just talked about to output data in the format that you already want. That's how you get ahead of this problem. But if you can't do that, now you have to figure out how to use regex, right? Maybe you need to do a little bit of scripting. If you're working with cloud log sources, you probably have to pull down that data with some Python scripting, do some additional transformation, and so on. And so that is, again, a whole, I don't want to say nightmare. It's a whole challenge that is an ongoing and never ending process, right? That requires really, again, a certain set of skills that not everyone has. And then we have to talk about maintaining all of that parsing, right? So vendors are going to update their products. Vendors are going to make changes to how their logs are being formatted or how those logs are output, and you need to make sure that your parsing keeps pace with that. On the kind of other end of this, though, there might be schema updates. If you're using something like ECS or Ceph Relief or SIM, the schema itself might change, and that change may be forced on you. It may not be forced on you. It's something that, again, you have to keep track of, and it's another task that goes on the SIM engineer or detection engineer's board. With storing data, obviously you can store your data in a SIM or a database or a data lake. Data ocean and data tsunami are not real terms. I just made them up because they sound good, and I'm sure at some point we'll hear that in some kind of actual product vendors marketing materials. I like data tsunami. I think that one really encapsulates what it can feel like sometimes to deal with storing data. But again, there are additional tasks associated with that, associated with maintaining the actual SIM or the database, right? There are different administration tasks associated with that. You need to make sure that your wherever you're storing data is performing well. The last thing that you need is to run a search and it take run a search for the last hour and it take 20 minutes, right? That's a clear failure in detection engineering. And there's also this other component of storage cost. Most of these solutions are quite expensive, and some of them charge by how much data you store. And so obviously the less data that you store, the less cost that you'll have. So that's something that the SIM engineer also, or the detection engineer also has to keep in mind. So yeah, this is all of the, what I call the engineer parts, and we'll get into this a little bit later in some later slides. And then there are all the other parts, right? So these are encompassing skills and mindsets and approaches and experiences that I think are somewhat unique or distinct from the engineering mindset, right? And keep in mind that the engineering parts and the other parts are both part of a detection engineer's responsibility. You know, they're expected to do both of these two sections. The first thing that is part of the other part is understanding your data. So you need to first understand the origin. Where does it come from, right? You have data in your SIM. You know, where did that data come from? What does it represent? The structure of your data. Just because you've parsed it doesn't mean that you might not have to go back and reparse it. Maybe the structure is not ideal for what you need to achieve. Maybe it's not normalized enough. The authority of your data. So sometimes you can have data sources or log sources that are overlapping. And just because something goes through one firewall doesn't mean that it wasn't blocked by another firewall, right? And that kind of situation is one in which we would need to understand the authority of each firewall, right? The first firewall may not be fully authoritative, and the second firewall is the one that you need to look at in order to really understand whether or not a particular piece of traffic was blocked, right? It's an example of authority. Category. If you can categorize your data, that's great. You know, that's just really a small component, but the generate, ship, and parse sections, this is just to keep in mind that as you're going through these other parts, you're probably going to have to go back and revisit all of these components, right? You're going to find, again, that maybe your data is not structured in a way that you want, so you need to change the parsing. Maybe you can't change the parsing, or even if you change the parsing, it wouldn't matter, so you got to go back and generate different data. Maybe you find out that the data that you are getting is late. It's not timely, so you need to go back and fix shipping problems, and so on and so forth. So just keep in mind that these are all things that you will have to revisit when you're kind of exploring or understanding your data. And the second part here is enrichment. So now you have your data, you have some kind of understanding of what that data is at a high level. And now we actually want to try and enrich the value of the data that we have. So one thing that you can do to add a bit of value is aggregation, right? So each of the events that we typically get from our environment are fairly atomic, right? We can make our events a little bit less atomic by doing some aggregation. That's always an option. We can do some filtering. We can filter out the events that we really don't need or that we don't think are going to provide security value. And then tagging. So tagging is just kind of a catch-all for what I consider to be additional categorization, but lower level categorization. And so the more information, human readable information, not data, information that you can add to a specific event, the more useful it's going to be along the lines to your analysts and of course to yourself when you're going back and actually creating content. So doing all that obviously requires that you have expertise in a SIM or an EDR or SOAR, whatever platform you're working in. And of course, it also kind of requires that you have an understanding of your environment, but we'll get to that. Third part here is finding and creating value, right? So we now understand our data. We have now added a bit of value or enriched the value of our data. Now we need to do something with that data, right? We need to produce information or somehow achieve some kind of security objective or security goal. Now, this section was a little bit difficult to put together because there's so much you could put in here. But in general, I see a few different approaches to like finding or creating value. One of the first approaches is around security policy or around compliance, right? So there are certain things that you need to do or that you need to make sure that people in your organization don't do. Those are defined in your policy and in your compliance requirements. You can monitor and enforce those things with detection content. The other thing that you can do is you can threat hunt, right? So you can just kind of freeform or maybe not freeform in a more directed and structured manner, which we'll get to. You can look for gaps and look for things that you're not detecting and find new ways to automate them. And then the kind of last thing is just protection gap mitigation. It's really not a great phrase. I wish I had a better phrase to describe this, but oftentimes you'll see or you'll find gaps in your protection, right? Things that you know are going to slip through that you at least want to have visibility of, and you can do that by creating content to find that type of activity and at least provide an alert or report or dashboard to find that activity. So those are some things that you can do to find and create value. Now, this is probably the most difficult part because what it requires are both internal knowledge and external knowledge. Internal knowledge is referring to kind of being an expert in your own organization. So being an expert in understanding what is in my environment. What are these assets? What are these servers? What do they do? How do they provide value to the business or to the organization? And how can I find them in the SIM? How can we build detections in the SIM or in our detection platform to protect those assets? Also, we can look at actors, right? Who are important people in the organization, who are our leaders, who are decision makers, who are making financial transactions, right? How do we focus our detections maybe on those individuals? Now, we can also look at the procedures and processes, right? Where is there potential for things to go wrong in the procedures and processes in our business? How can we detect those procedures and processes going wrong? And then how can we develop some kind of insight to alert people to the situation? And then there's the whole conversation around risk and business alignment. We'll get to that. External knowledge is, as you might imagine, knowledge about things that are not really specific to your organization, right? So knowledge about threat actors, an understanding of what tools and software threat actors use, what techniques those tools and software leverage, and what kind of tactic that might fall under. These two categories, again, are not really overlapping. It's not necessarily the case that because you're an expert in threat intelligence or threat hunting, that you're going to be an expert in your organization or vice versa, right? And we'll get to why these two components are really critical, and we'll hone in on them. And the last portion here, though, is automate, right? So now we've got our data, we've enriched it, we've found some specific things, some specific objectives that we want to achieve or things that we want visibility of, and we want to automate delivery of those insights as much as possible. So do we need to build a query, a rule, a dashboard, report, a playbook? Again, those things require that you know how to use your platform, that you know how to use your SIM, You'd be surprised how many people don't really understand how to use their SIM to its fullest capabilities. That's really not a knock on people. Like, SIMs are complicated, these tools are complicated, and one of the things that we'll get into is that working with data and understanding data and the mindset that you need to do all of the other parts is, again, a little bit different than the engineering parts, right? So it's not a surprise that people struggle to do all of these things when they are so focused on all the engineering parts that we just talked about. I will pause here to highlight internal knowledge because I want to emphasize how important knowing your environment is. This is one thing, and this is absolutely not to knock MSSPs and MDRs, but it's just a note. You can't expect your MSSP or MDR to be an expert in your own organization, especially not an expert like you should be in your own organization. There are some really, really good reasons to utilize an MSSP and MDR. I don't want to discourage anyone at all from utilizing an MSSP or MDR, outsourcing your SOC in that way. But just know that if you do, this is where you're going to need to make up that deficiency. You're going to need to become a super expert in internal knowledge, and not just internal knowledge, but communicating that internal knowledge to your vendor partner. Oh, yeah. All right, so that was kind of a lot, I know, but this is how complex detection engineering is. And it requires a lot, in my opinion, a lot of different areas of expertise that really, it's difficult to expect anyone to have this range of expertise and proficiency, right? It's not, again, enough to just know how to use the tools. You have to know why you're using the tools and what for. And these two different approaches, these two kind of phases, really are just really difficult to tie together. When you're looking for a good detection engineer, you're kind of looking for a unicorn. If you're looking for a detection engineer that's going to cover all these things, you're kind of looking for a unicorn. That's good for us unicorns because we're highly valued, right? But I think you get the point, right? That detection engineers are wearing a lot of hats. And definitely my opinion is that there are not enough heads to wear those hats, and there are just way too many hats to begin with. This is really just a brief note, which is that people try to fix deficiencies in the processes that I just described by purchasing new technology. I don't always believe in this approach. There are very good reasons to purchase a SOAR or to purchase a SIM, a new SIM. Those reasons, though, are going to be very narrowly defined, and you cannot fix problems with your larger overall processes that we just described by buying a new technology, right? You can't fix a people problem with SOAR. For the most part, don't tell the SOAR vendors that. I know that's a point of contention. You can't fix a lack of robust or well-defined processes with SOAR, right? SOAR helps you automate those processes, doesn't help you come up with them in the first place. You can't fix a poor pipeline or a poor understanding of what data you need to collect by getting a new SIM, right? You can't fix a lack of good content with a new SIM. You're still going to have to build new content. And all these things, right, they affect your operational metrics. They affect your organizational alignment. They affect your return on investment, which are three kind of core business value, tenets that folks kind of relate with. So again, this is just really more of a note. We'll go to the next slide. And yeah, this is the point where I tell you that you deserve better. As a detection engineer, you're stretched really thin. You're being asked to do way too many things. You don't have the time to do them. You might not have the expertise to do them. You're not really appreciated by, in some ways, by the larger security community. I think, DEF CON, I forget what number, but this was before it was in person canceled. They had just added the Blue Team Village maybe like a year or 2 years ago. I think that says a lot. I think it says a lot about what the larger kind of security community thinks about us when it's only in the last 2 years that we have a blue team village. Obviously, like DEF CON's not, it's a hacker convention, right? So you would not necessarily think that blue team would be included in that category, but I think it does. So anyway, that's more of an aside. But so what I'm saying is that you actually deserve to feel like you've done a job well, and that you can sleep soundly at night knowing that the detections that you put in place are going to do the work for you, and that when you get to work in the morning, you're not constantly having to rehash old problems that you could never fix because you didn't have the time, you didn't have the expertise, and you didn't have the capability, right? So you deserve that. We all deserve that as detection engineers. We deserve to be supported and appreciated by our leadership and from other teams and other departments in the larger community, right? We personally, if we go back to again to kind of the detection, see if we can actually get back there. Yeah, if we look at this section here, right, where we're generating data, this section requires that you have strong partnership from the product owners, or from the people that actually own the servers and the gateways and the workstations and the servers. And you don't always get that as a detection engineer. You don't get the respect. No, you don't get the cooperation that you really need. There's a way to get that cooperation, and we'll talk about that. When it comes to finding and creating value, you need to have strong partnership with leadership and with those folks in the positions who can help you understand policy, help you understand compliance requirements, help you understand what your environment looks like, and help you understand risk, right? You cannot do those things really on your own, and you need partnership from the other teams in order to really excel in those sections, right? And it's hard to get that as a detection engineer, but you deserve it. Of course, funding, right? You deserve to have all the tools and technologies that you really need, and not the tools and technologies that you don't need. You deserve to have more people on your team, and you deserve to have the training that you deserve. But the problem is that, again, the reason why we're in this place, why we don't have these things, is because we have done a really poor job of describing what it is we do and how complex it is and what we need in order to do our job. Again, all of what we've just talked about is an effort to try and describe that a little bit better, right? So you could actually take these things, share them with the rest of your team, share them with your management, and say, look, this is a distinct component or area of responsibility that I have, and I'm struggling with it. I need help from X, Y, and Z people, or people who understand this or that, or what have you. All right, so you deserve better. So how do we do better? The first thing is in splitting duties. Now, this is potentially controversial because I've read a lot of articles, and I know that it's especially the case with some people internally, and just the general approach that a lot of people have been taking is to kind of move towards more integrated teams. That's certainly a good idea when you have the money, when you have a large team to work with, and you have really, really smart people. I don't think that most SOC teams are in a place where they have a lot of people, a lot of money, and a lot of expertise. I think we're working with very little, and when you're working with limited resources and limited expertise, you have to focus on what you're good at. And when we're talking about splitting the duties, we're talking about these two different processes and phases that we just covered. So on the left, we have kind of the more engineering mindset, right? And on the right, we have the more analyst, what I call the analyst mindset. I'm sure there's another word for it. So I'm sure you're familiar with this concept of the human brain coming in like two halves, right? The left and the right. The left brain is said to be a bit more technical, while the right brain is a little bit more creative. The reality is that things are probably not that simple, but it does kind of illustrate the point which I'm trying to make, which is that when you are experiencing task saturation, which is not something that we've mentioned up until now. Task saturation is when you, let's go back to one of the other slides. Task saturation is a term that they use in aviation, and it's when pilots feel like they have too much to do, and they don't have enough time, tools, or resources to make that happen, right? So that should sound familiar to you as a detection engineer. You at this point should be screaming, yes, task saturation. That's exactly what's happening to me. I have way too many things to do, not enough time, not enough resources, and it's impairing my ability to do my job. So when you have task saturation, let me back up a second. Some of like the more recent scientific research in this whole kind of split brain stuff is actually painting the story that the right brain, which they think is kind of the more dominant and actually more complex brain, created the left brain or utilizes the left brain to address task saturation, right? So the right brain is actually somewhat more in control. It sees the bigger picture, and it doesn't want to get caught up with all the little stuff in the weeds, right? So it hands that off to the left brain. And this whole kind of approach of taking some of the tasks that we know to be very tedious and require very, very kind of specific knowledge about certain things, we can actually offload that to folks that are already very in the engineering mindset, right? There are people in security analytics today. I don't want to, speak poorly about these people because they are very smart. But what I'm trying to say is that it's very difficult to take someone who has an engineering mindset and ask them to create content. It's very difficult to take someone who has an engineering mindset and ask them to work with data, interpret data, structure data, and then produce interesting insights that are relevant to the security value and business value. There's just two different mindsets. So what I'm trying to say here is, if you are working with limited budget, limited team size, find people. Don't ask your engineers to be analysts, and don't ask your analysts to be engineers. Find people who specialize in one of these categories and hire both of them. So yeah, that's that part. Translating value. Okay, so the reason why we don't get a lot of support and why people don't, again, see us as highly complex is because we just have a really difficult time describing what we do, and more importantly, why it matters, right? This is something that I feel I have kind of learned more since venturing into sales and since venturing more into technical account management and business, is that it's not enough to just describe what you do. You have to describe why it matters. And specifically in our case, we have to describe why it matters to the business. So when someone asks what you do and how you're doing it, the wrong way to do it is to give them metrics that really don't translate into security value to begin with, and then also don't translate into business value, right? So we need to find, even if we translate these things, they end up being meaningless, and we don't want to communicate meaningless information to the people that are giving us the money to buy new technologies, or giving us the money to get new training or hire a new headcount, right? We need to find a way to communicate with the kind of bag holders and do a better job of it. Again, something that I think we've struggled to do in security analytics from the beginning. And so what I'm proposing is that we do a better job at working backwards from business value. So not taking all the work that you've done and then trying to explain why it's relevant, but finding a purpose from the beginning and then working towards that purpose with your engineering and with your detection. So you start off by saying, what do I need to detect? What threat actors, techniques, tools, how can I demonstrate that all this is relevant to the business? Ask those questions first, because you can, from here, you can actually find detections or build detections. You can build all the rest out. This is the hardest part to do, which is explain why you're relevant. Start with this, right? Second part is, how can I detect X? What log sources, data sources do I need? What detection logic should I use, right? So come up with an objective, then figure out what you need to achieve that objective, right? Once you figured out what you need to achieve that objective, execute on it, right? And execute on it well, right? Figure out how you can automate it. Figure out what is the best way to execute on that, right? Maybe you don't need that detection that you built to be an alert because it's not very actionable or it happens all the time. Maybe it's more useful as a dashboard or a safe search or a report, right? Think about these things. Think about like, what are you going to do with it and why does it matter and how are other people going to use it, right? So when the problem here, though, that we really can't avoid is that we have to work with what we've got. We don't really, most people don't really, and most teams don't really have an ability to actually translate what you do into real business value. It's very, very difficult, and it's not often that you can actually see folks take security value, let alone detection value, and translate it into real business value or something that looks like a real business value, right? So I want to set expectations, right? The expectation here that I want to set is that at best, what we're kind of shooting for is a cheap imitation of business value, right? We want something that kind of looks like a business value, sounds like a business value, until you look a little bit closer, and then that's where that's where a good CISO or where a good leader really comes in. But we can help them out by kind of taking components that we know work and then changing them just a little bit to kind of look like things that we can actually provide. All right. So where we can, we want to steal recognizable elements that already exist. Right. So if you have existing business metrics, find out what those metrics are, and then find out how you can provide visibility or impact those metrics through the work that you do. You also want to take existing risk models if you have them. Threat modeling would be great, and find a way to describe the work that you do in the context of those risks. Also, this is more of like a side point, but like find a way to like enable solutions, enable growth, be an innovator and a differentiator for the business, not within your own team, but for the business, right? You want to find ways to make security a benefit, right, and not a cost. Obviously, that's much easier said than done, right? So what does that end up looking like? So there's some things that translate well, other things that don't translate well at all. Risk models, especially when it comes to assets and services, we can define that as a list of critical assets, critical services, and critical data. Those are things that we can work into all of our detections, and then we can describe how those detections apply. We can describe our own responsiveness, our own timeliness. We can describe our own detection coverage, and we can also, in lieu of strong threat modeling, we can actually work backwards from industry to describe what threat actors we think are targeting us, what techniques those threat actors use, and then what tools those techniques are associated with. And we can build really these stories and these narratives around how we're tailoring our detection capability to the specific business that we're working for. So we'll get into this more, but really the important takeaway here is what you need to do is find ways to tell more interesting stories about the work that you do. And they can't just be interesting, they need to also be relevant and in context of the business. You do these things, and I guarantee you that anytime you go to another team and you need some help from them because you need to configure something or you don't understand how something works, if you can say, well, this is what I'm trying to achieve, this is how it benefits the business, and this is the component that I need help with in order to reach that objective. I think people like that kind of logic. And I think that, you can always take that kind of thing up the chain and say like, look, this is what we're trying to do. If you're not going to help me, this is what you're blocking, right? That's a little bit strong arm, but, give yourself credibility. This is really what I'm trying to say. So yeah, how do we communicate that value? How do we give ourselves credibility? We've got about 10 minutes here, so I'm going to try and speed through this. the first component is, well, this is actually where I talk about MITRE ATT&CK and where I talk about our product, the Threat Detection Marketplace. Now, I don't want to, pretend like this is really not me giving you the TDM pitch. This is me explaining how we do all the things I just talked about, also with our Threat Detection Marketplace and with some of the tools that we leverage. So in short, if you don't know, our Threat Detection Marketplace is this living library of detection queries, rules, etc. We have over 2,800 Sigma rules, which are just like detection concepts that can be translated into other platforms. And almost all of our content is tagged with MITRE ATT&CK attributes, developing new content almost on a daily basis. We have like 90 plus new rules a month. The research for every rule is built in. There are references to it. You can read it. There are also timelines built in for CVEs. Yeah, this is just really an explanation of what the TDM is. But how does this relate to everything we just talked about? Okay, so let's start with MITRE ATT&CK. The first thing to discuss is like what kind of metrics can we share with leadership, right? If you can describe where you are today, where you need to go tomorrow, and how much you have progressed in the past week, month, quarter, year, whatever, all of that is like metrics gold. Managers and leadership love to see that. They want to see that you know what you're doing today, what you need to do better tomorrow, and how you're going to get there, right? MITRE ATT&CK gives us that capability, especially when you are tagging all of your rules with techniques, tools, threat actors, tactics, right? In our platform, you can actually, by utilizing our content and letting us know what content you've deployed, you can actually see how many techniques you've covered, how many tools you've covered when it comes to detections, how many actors you covered, your overall coverage, and you can actually see all of that over time. So immediately on one page, you just have a very clear sense of where you are at today and how much you've progressed over time. Now there are drill downs on this page that I, because it's a screenshot, I can't really show you, but you can also see what techniques you don't have coverage of. And when you click on that technique, it'll take you to all the rules that provide coverage of that technique or that tool or that threat actor, right? So immediately we have where we are at today, where we need to go, how we need to get there, and how much we've improved over the last whatever period. The second part is kind of maybe talking less about coverage, which is more of a disconnected metric, and talking more about how we can demonstrate that our detections are relevant to the organization or to the business, right? So if you have existing risk and threat modeling to pull from, you can go directly from that threat modeling, ideally, to threat actors and techniques and tools, right? So in our platform, you can search for content by technique, you can search for content by tool, tactic, or threat actor, and now you have this very clear mapping. You have whatever team saying these are the threats that we care about. All you have to do is search for them and find those detections in the platform and implement them. And now you can directly tie the work that you've done back to some existing frameworks in your threat modeling or risk modeling. Now, if you don't have that, many teams don't have actual threat modeling or very poor risk modeling, you can do something even more simple. MITRE ATT&CK has each of their threat actors, most of them are described by the industries that they also target. So just by going to the MITRE ATT&CK kind of page, looking at all the actors, you can do a Control F search in that page, look for your industry, and within 5 minutes, put together a list of actors that are probably targeting your industry. From there, what you want to do is look at all those threat actors, figure out what techniques and tools they're using, and now you have your search components in the threat detection marketplace, right? So you just go search for those techniques, those tools. Now you can say that you've deployed those techniques and tools, or detections for those techniques and tools. Those techniques and tools are for these threat actors. These threat actors target our industry. Now we have an interesting and compelling business story to tell. Now, when you're building a detection, right, really often the most expensive part or the most costly part from a time perspective is the research, right? But when you get a detection from us, the research has already been done for you, right? Most of our detections in our platform have links to the original research articles. CVEs and articles and exploits have an entire timeline available that will kind of help you describe how reactive or proactive you have been in deploying a particular detection, right? So you can see when the exploit was published, or when the CVE was published, when offensive security tools were published, when we published a detection. And this is, again, another credible story that you can tell about your ability to counter emerging threats. We also talked about kind of working backwards from business value, right? So there is that component of figuring out the requirements. Figuring out the requirements in order to detect or fulfill your detection objective is difficult, right? But it's much easier if you have a detection to work from. So you can now, once you find a detection for the thing that you want to detect, you now need to work backwards from what log source, what data source am I looking for, and then what fields do we need. So this is an example of, this is a few like mixed together screenshots of a rule. You can see the reference to the research article that was used to build this detection. You can see the log source that it needs, web logs from proxy, WAF, or etc. Not in this picture is the fields and field values that you would need, the actual detection logic. So now you clearly know what log source you need to be collecting, what fields you need to be collecting, and then what field values you need. So immediately we've wiped out a bunch of work in figuring out how do I detect this particular thing, right? You already have a detection for it, and now you just need to make sure that you're actually collecting it, collecting the data. And after you kind of look at a few more rules, you'll have a pretty good sense of where you're at in that larger process that we talked earlier, right? So again, your questions that you should be asking yourself now are, is this data even being generated? Is it being collected, parsed, and stored? Do we have all the requirements that we need to fulfill our detection objective? What about enrichment and filtering and so on, right? We go through all this, and the idea is that you don't have to go through all this again, that you can skip to the parts that you need because you'll already know what your requirements are and what you're lacking. Okay, so we've got 3 minutes left. We went through it really fast, but again, the point I'm trying to make here is this. Come up with a detection objective, find a detection which fulfills that objective, and then just make sure that you have the logs to meet that objective. As long as your detection objectives are aligned and framed in a way that is relevant to the business, which you can do through MITRE ATT&CK, you can do by aligning yourself to the threat models and risk models that your business has, you can do through all these other processes, right? You're going to get all of those things that we talked about, right? Better cooperation, better support, hopefully better funding, and just better satisfaction, right? When you know that you're doing your job better and that you're doing your job well, it means so much, right? I think all of us, at the end of the day, really just want to know that we've done a good job. And in short, the takeaway here should be, you'll know that you've done a good job when you can explain the work that you do and how it impacts the business. So hopefully you've learned a few things and we've elevated the level of conversation here. There's one question, which is, can SOC engineering work be implemented in DevOps, an agile way of working? Could it make engineering lives easier? Yeah, yes and no. Yes is the theme. No, because it's really not that simple. Like, it takes a lot of work to get it to that point. So, in an ideal world, yes, but it's just not the reality of where we're at, right? We're still just struggling to even grasp these fundamentals. When you've grasped the fundamentals, then you can look at optimizing things, right? You can look at improving things and coming up with better ways to do things. But if you're barely even struggling to get through the engineering part, you're barely struggling to get through the other parts, adding more there isn't necessarily the solution. And yeah, that's it. So hopefully, again, you've taken something away from this webinar. If you haven't already, please sign up at tdm.socprime.com. It's free to register. You can access a lot of content, do all the things that we just talked about. And it was a pleasure speaking with you all or presenting to you all. And I hope that you have a wonderful, awesome rest of your day.